Kristiansand is a seaside resort on the Norwegian Riviera. Kristiansund is a harbour town deep in the western fjords. Just one letter and over 1,000 kilometres of scenery separate them as I travel around the coast from Sund2Sand over land. I'm starting my journey from Kristiansund to Kristiansand, naturally in Oslo. I landed in Norway late the previous evening at Oslo, and after an overnight stop at the airport, I'm arriving into Kristiansund on the morning flight. Though there's not much to see, as a thick layer of cloud obscures what should be a very pretty landing into the city's airport. Spread out over 3 islands, Kirklandet, Innlandet and Nordlandet, the city of Kristiansund has one of the highest population densities in Norway, with a total land mass of just 8.45 square kilometres and a population of more than 18,000 people. Before the introduction of postal codes in Norway in 1968, there was so much misdirection of mail between the two almost identically named cities that it was obligatory to add an N for Nord after Kristiansund and an S for Sur after Kristiansand in addresses to avoid misdirection, and in some instances the town is still referred to as Kristiansund N. The city is defined by the strait, or sund, that is formed by the 3 islands creating a large natural harbour hidden from the sea, which is why the old name for the town was Fosna, or Fossen, which means hiding place or hidden port. It wasn't until 1742 that the town was renamed after Danish Norwegian king Christian VI. The Sund is likely to have attracted some of the earliest settlers to the area around 10,000 years ago, being ice-free and abundant in seafood. However, it wasn't until the Middle Ages that a small fishing harbour grew up around Fossen, and not until the 17th century that it grew into any form of settlement. As the town grew in size, the government established a customs station here, a substation of the main trading port in Trondheim. With the water being so important to Kristiansund, it's unsurprising that it was very early into having a motor ferry to shuttle between the islands. The Sundbåt, literally straight boat, is a small shuttle boat that zigzags across the strait on a roughly half-hourly repeating service and has been operating continuously, except Sundays, since the 18th of November 1876. Today, the service shuttles between the main landing stage at Kirklandet in the historic centre of the town and landing points on Innlandet and the west side of Nordlandet before returning to Kirklandet and then heading out again to Melviken on the north side of Nordlandet and Gommelandet on the far side of Kirklandet before returning to Kirklandet to start the route all over again. Whilst these days the bridges and bus routes across the town mean that most people can access the other islands with ease, it's still a popular service, particularly with tourists and especially with, in 2025, it being free to use. Just by the main Sundbåt stop on the waterfront are a series of statues. The Klippfiskeringe, or Clipfish Woman, is the town's mascot and a tribute to the women who worked in the clipfish, dried salt cod industry in the town for over 300 years. Whilst opposite her is the Sildgutten, or Herring Boy, a statue marking the era when the harbour was bustling with small trawlers and little boys running around with herring hooks. In April 1940, German bombing of the city took out around 800 of the city's 1,300 buildings. Kristiansund by itself accounts for 28% of the total damage to buildings in Norway during World War II. Following the war, the reconstruction of the city was rapid, with 68% of the city having been rebuilt by 1950. The city is a cultural centre of Norway with a particular connection to opera, being home to the first opera house to open in the country in 1928 and the annual opera festival that's taken place every February since 1971. A short distance away from the main harbour and up the waters that create the isthmus that Gommelandet is on is the Mellemværftet, or Middle Yard, a historic shipyard and these days cultural monument that forms part of the Nordre Museum. First established in 1791, the shipyard was in continuous operation until 1978. It became a protected monument just 6 years later, in 1984. The shipyard has 3 slipways and a large workshop building built in half timber, half brick, dating from the latter part of the 19th century. The preserved shipyard also includes a sawmill, a materials shed, materials dock, and a tilting crane on the quayside. When the site was in full use, the shipyard owners lived in the residential building on the site, which dates from 1890, and in the 1900 census had 28 people living in it. In its heyday, the shipyard served the city's large fleet of small sailing ships, mainly used in the cod fisheries, collecting the raw ingredients for clipfish production. the yard both built and maintained for ships of the fleet. The western side of Kirklandet is home to some large open spaces all running into each other that makes it a pleasant area to go for a wander, starting with the Øverparken. Which along the formal planting is home to some monuments and a large fountain depicting a dolphin. Immediately behind Øverparken is the Kirklandet Kirke. The original church on this site was destroyed in the German bombing raids, and the current church, which was consecrated on the 24th of May 1964, after just 3 years of construction, is considered to be one of the first truly modern church buildings in the country. Across the church are 320 small windows that are all shades of red or yellow. From the rear of the Kirklandet Kirke, you're straight into the Vanndamman, one of the highest points of the island and a popular hiking area. The Vanndamman is a series of ponds that were previously used as a water supply for the city up until 1979, but is now a recreational area. Closest to the city is the Vanndamman or Swan Pond, the oldest of the ponds, and is today a haven for the city's ducks and swans. Around the outside of a fenced-off pond are a children's play park as well as a cafe, and in the centre of the pond is a water feature. Sitting above the Swan Pond at a higher level are the Mellemværftet and the Vestness, or Middle Pond and West Pond. The two are at the same level and only separated by a small footpath that you can walk across to get views up and down the two ponds. Behind the West Pond is the Gravendam, or Grave Pond, which is separated from the West Pond by a much larger footpath sitting on top of a dam. At the rear of the Grave Pond, or perhaps in this instance Grave Dam is a better translation, is a pretty impressive dam wall that falls away down into the woods behind the pond and down towards the coast. As the city grew rapidly in the 19th century, the city began to develop a major problem with its water supply. The dam system was built using the topography of the hills around the Varden watchtower, using the hollows between the hills to collect and store rainwater that was funneled down into it from the surrounding area, and then dammed as the rear to create the ponds, which could then be used as a reservoir to supply the city's needs. As the needs of the city increased further, dams were added back up the slope to extend the ponds and expand the capacity, leading to the multiple ponds and the very large dam at the far end of the Gravendam that exists to today. When the system was taken out of use as a public water supply, it was converted into a recreational area, with the gutter system used to feed the ponds turned into hiking trails. You can wander beyond the rear of the last pond and head out across the ridge of the hill until it comes to a natural end of the western side of the island and a view out across the Bremsnfjorden to the island of Øverøya. It's only once you're clear of the fjord that you reach the sea, which is why the strait at Kristiansund is so well hidden. Sitting above the ponds and above the gutters feeding all that water to them, at the highest point of the city is the old guard post and lookout tower, the Varden, or watchtower. The top of the hill is 78 metres above sea level, and from here there are excellent views out over the islands of Kristiansund and on a clear day out to the further outlying islands. A tower was first built here in 1801 and used as a guard station for the Norwegian optical telegraph. With this, messages could be sent to Trondheim long before radio communications became possible. The original wooden tower was replaced by a brick tower in 1892, but this was demolished in 1976 and rebuilt in 1983. The tower is open all year round, with a bell you can ring if the door is locked for the fire safety duty officer to remotely unlock it for you. Inside the tower, on the lower floor, are a series of murals. The staircase takes you up to the viewing platform on the top floor, from where there are even better views out over the fjords and beyond than from the ground level, along the telescope if you want to see further. For my next stop, as it was a Sunday and no boats were running, I opted to take the bus for 4 kilometres across Kirklandet, over the Overvangerbrua that clears the isthmus joining Kirklandet to Gommelandet, and then over the significantly more impressive Nordsundbrua that links Kirklandet and Gommelandet to Nordlandet. Before reaching my destination of the Kristiansundskiltet, the Hollywood-style sign hailing the town's name that's one of the most visible elements of the city as you enter the strait from the fjord. It's also a really good location for stunning views out over the natural harbour and both Kirklandet and Inlandet, particularly on a sunny day. From the Kristiansund sign, there's a pleasant 4 kilometre or so walk that you can take back over the Nordsundbrua to the north coast of Kirklandet to explore the coastline and its history. Starting at the beach at Lasken. Before heading up towards the northernmost point of the island, the ruins of a former World War II gun emplacement at Nordre Langhaugen. From here you have excellent views out of the whole of the north coast of the island and out into the open ocean, protecting both eastern and western approaches to the strait. Slightly further down the coast and you reach the Kystbatteri, or coastal battery. This is an even larger collection of gun emplacements and fortifications that lined the northern stretch of the island, all part of the Atlantic Wall, the massive fortifications built by the Nazis to try and turn Europe into an impenetrable fortress. Built between 1942 and 1944, the fortifications stretch from the very north of Norway all the way around its coast, down the western coast of Denmark and Germany, along the coast of the Netherlands and Belgium and the Atlantic coast of France, all the way to the Spanish border, as well as additional forts and bunkers on the occupied Channel Islands. At around 2,687 kilometres, or 1,670 miles long, most of the structures were built using forced labour. Today, the ruins of the fortifications dot the landscape of the Atlantic coast of Europe, from bunkers in Kirklandet all the way down to the fortifications in Hundai on the Spanish border. My tour of the north coast of Kirklandet brought me back into town past the church and down to my hotel where I was able to rest my weary feet ahead of moving on to the next destination the following morning. The next leg of my journey from Kristiansund to Kristiansand was a genteel 150-kilometre, just under 4-hour bus trip from Kristiansund down the coast to Ålesund, with the first part of the trip being to the ferry terminal in Molde. Cue the montage. After a 20 or so minute wait in the bus station in Molde, partly a comfort break, but also a comfortable bit of padding in the timetable to ensure the bus doesn't miss the ferry, the driver drives a short distance to the ferry terminal and on to the service across the Vestness, which takes about 40 minutes. You can remain on the bus, or get out and stretch your legs on deck, or head down into the cafe for a coffee, and to my utter bewilderment, no waffles. They'd not had any delivered. I wasn't the only one shocked by the lack of a Norwegian staple. The ferry is crossing the Romsdalsfjord, the 9th longest fjord in Norway, with a distance of 88 kilometres or 55 miles. The ferry crosses the point where the fjord is at its deepest, of 550 metres or 1,800 feet. I don't think there's any risk of the ferry grounding on this route. This is also about the widest point of the fjord at nearly 12 kilometres or 7.5 miles wide, and the lengthy break of the crossing means the driver is good to go all the way through to Ålesund without needing to change. So as soon as we get the green light to disembark the ferry, cue the next montage. After arriving in Ålesund and dropping off bags in a hotel, I picked up a bus and headed out to the very western edge of the city at Sævollen. Much like Kristiansund, Ålesund is spread out over 3 islands, with the centre of Hesse wrapping around Sundbåt and the western end of Nordre to create another large natural harbour. Hesse is the westernmost of the 3 islands, and Sævollen is the westernmost bus stop on the island. The island is dominated by the 314-metre tall Sundtoppen, which sits in the middle of the island with just a narrow strip of land for south and west, which creates an almost perfect location for a coastal path and a pleasant, if you ignore the odd hefty shower passing through, walk. The walk takes you around the coastline between the almost sheer cliff sides of Sundtoppen, with views out to the outlying islands. From the coastal path there are views out across the Bergen towards the islands of Godøy and Harøyland, as well as the smaller islands further out into the North Atlantic itself. You can take a path down to the water's edge and out onto the ruins of a former gun emplacement to get better views out across the fjord, including, if you time it right, watching one of the many cruise ships that call on Ålesund each day departing. There are also excellent views back to Sundtoppen, which by this point has gone from a wall of rock to doing a very good impersonation of a chunk of Toblerone. A little further along the coast and heading into the northwestern corner of Hesse, you reach Tueneset. Today the area is home to one of Northern Europe's largest saltwater aquariums, the Atlanterhavsparken, but 80 years ago it was the site of a major fortification on the Atlantic Wall. The Tueneset Kystbatteri consists of a large number of ruins, from basic foundations of buildings to major bunkers and even replica armaments from the day. On the bus ride back into the city centre, you cross the Steinvågsbrua over the Steinvågssundet that joins Hesse to Sundbåt. From Ålesund, the next leg of my journey was to be the longest and perhaps the most brutal. Nearly 10 hours on the bus, including 3 ferry crossings for 420 or so kilometres to Norway's second city, Bergen, though a big comfy seat at the front of the top deck certainly helped. From Ålesund, it was only a short drive of 50 minutes to the first ferry of the day, with a short 20-minute crossing of the Journies from Svolvågen to Festøya, with the top deck of the bus proving to be the perfect viewing point for this short crossing. From Festøya, it was time to get properly comfortable for the 4.5 hour long and spectacular drive, including another ferry ride to the town of Førde. Much like Molde on the journey between Kristiansund and Ålesund, Forde is a carefully timed rest stop. 45 minutes to the bus station to get out, stretch the legs, use the facilities, allow the driver to comply with driving time regulations, and make sure the bus is on time for the final push on the ferry from Larvik to Oppedal, and then on to Bergen. The Nordhollandsbrua marks the entrance into Bergen, crossing the Salhusfjorden and Osterfjorden, and pretty much marking the end of my journey for the evening. Next time, I continue my journey from Kristiansund to Kristiansand by taking the Norway, from Bergen to Haugesund, across some more impressive Norwegian tunnel bridge combos. Explore the 12th largest city in Norway, which, guess what? It's only 2 islands, plus the mainland. And meet the first King of Norway and shampoo model, Harald Fairhair.